I didn't raise my voice when the county environmental inspector finished walking the creek line. I didn't argue when the HOA president insisted, for the third time that morning, that I was exaggerating the damage and trespassing on community improvements. I stood on the edge of what used to be a narrow, clear-flowing channel, hands in my jacket pockets, listening to the water struggle where it no longer should have been pooling. Concrete doesn't look dramatic when it's poured illegally. It looks neat, intentional, permanent. That's why most people don't realize what it's doing until it's too late. The inspector crouched, brushed wet soil from a rebar edge sticking out of the slab, and asked one quiet question that changed the entire posture of the group behind me. He wanted to know who authorized a structural modification to a mapped drainage corridor without a wetlands variance or Army Corps review. The HOA president answered quickly, confidently, the way people do when they've never been challenged by someone with actual authority. She said the association had approved it internally to control erosion and improve aesthetics. She said it like those words carried weight. I reached into my truck and handed the inspector a folder he hadn't asked for yet. Inside were the original hydrology maps, the county's floodplain overlays, and the environmental impact exemption, denial the developer had received 22 years earlier and quietly ignored. I didn't explain them. I didn't point. I just waited. The inspector stood, flipped through 3 pages, then stopped entirely. He looked back at the concrete slab, then upstream, then down toward the houses clustered too close to the low ground. He asked the HOA president if she was aware this channel had been legally classified as a protected seasonal tributary. She laughed once, sharp and defensive, and said it was just a ditch. That was when the inspector said the word wetland, not as a threat, not loudly, just as a fact. And in that moment, standing ankle-deep in water that hadn't existed there a month earlier, I knew the neighborhood behind us was about to learn the difference between landscaping and infrastructure. Before any of that happened, before inspectors and concrete and people suddenly pretending to care about water flow, my life revolved around the kind of quiet you only notice once it's gone. I moved out there for reasons that don't make sense to people who measure success by proximity to other people. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. I wasn't hiding. I just wanted land that behaved the way land is supposed to behave, and days that didn't require permission. The property sat just outside what the county still officially called unincorporated, though that line had been inching closer every year. I bought it after my divorce when I realized that the only thing I actually wanted was something that didn't change its expectations of me depending on my mood. The house was modest, built long before open-concept floor plans became a personality trait. The back porch overlooked the creek, which curved gently through the low ground before disappearing into trees that had never been trimmed for curb appeal. In spring, the water ran clear and fast. In late summer, it slowed to a patient trickle, doing exactly what it had done for longer than anyone in the HOA had been alive. My mornings were simple. Coffee on the porch, watching mist lift where cold. Water met warming air. I kept a notebook by the door and wrote down things most people wouldn't bother with. Rainfall amounts, soil saturation, how long the creek took to settle after a storm. It wasn't obsession. It was familiarity. When you live somewhere long enough, the land tells you what's normal, and anything outside that stands out immediately. I didn't attend neighborhood meetings because there weren't any. There were no boards, no committees, no laminated signs, telling you what kind of mailbox expressed appropriate values. Neighbors waved when they drove by. Sometimes they stopped to talk, sometimes they didn't. Nobody kept track. Nobody cared. That kind of freedom spoils you quietly. The creek wasn't decorative to me, it was functional. It carried runoff away. From higher ground, fed into a larger drainage system downstream, and kept the soil from turning sour after heavy rains. The county maps reflected that, even if the language was dry and buried in appendices, no one reads unless something goes wrong. I didn't own the water in some abstract sense, but I was responsible for not interfering with it. That responsibility mattered to me more than ownership ever did. I planted nothing near it that couldn't tolerate flooding. I never straightened its banks or tried to make it look intentional. Water doesn't respect intention. It respects gravity and space. Give it both, and it behaves. Take either away, and it starts looking for alternatives. The subdivision arrived slowly enough that it felt almost polite at first. Survey flags appeared along the ridge line, then machinery noise distant and intermittent. Eventually, paved roads replaced dirt access paths, and identical houses rose where open ground used to absorb rain without complaint. I noticed, but I didn't interfere. Development happens. I understood that. My land wasn't part of it, and the creek didn't change its course just because someone else had decided to build nearby. At least, not at first. The HOA formed the way they always do, quietly and confidently, assuming that governance expands naturally with population. I received a welcome packet by mail, even though my address wasn't included on any of their official maps. It talked about community standards and shared responsibility. I recycled it without reading much past the logo. That was my mistake, in hindsight, not because I needed to comply, but because I underestimated how far certainty can travel when no one stops it early. Everything I had built my days around, the predictability, the restraint, the assumption that people would check, facts before pouring concrete into moving water, was already being tested. I just didn't know it yet, and the creek still flowed the way it always had, right up until someone decided it shouldn't. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come with a letter or a meeting notice. It came with silence. The creek didn't sound the same after a midweek storm that should have passed through without consequence. I noticed it the next morning while walking the lower boundary, boots sinking slightly more than they should have in ground that normally drained. Overnight. The water level was higher, not dangerously so, but stubborn, as if it had lost its sense of direction. I stood there longer than usual, watching the surface ripple against banks that were used to breathing in and out with the seasons. At first, I assumed debris, a fallen limb upstream, maybe construction runoff clogging a bend temporarily. Development. Upstream often causes small disruptions before things settle, but by the afternoon, the water hadn't dropped. It sat where it didn't belong, pressing into grasses that had never been underwater for more than a few hours at a time. That's when familiarity turned into concern. I walked upstream toward the subdivision boundary, following the creek's path the way I always had, until I reached the point where the land stopped feeling like mine. The trees thinned. The ground changed texture. And there, where the water should have narrowed and picked up speed, it slowed to a crawl behind something gray and unnaturally straight. Concrete. Not poured with care, not shaped to guide flow, but dumped and reinforced, as if the creek were a nuisance instead of a system. Someone had built a low retaining structure across part of the channel, diverting water sideways and compressing the flow into a bottleneck that couldn't handle even moderate rain. It was new, fresh enough that the edges still looked raw. Stood there for a long time, longer than anger would have justified, trying to understand how anyone could look at moving water and decide it was something to be controlled with shortcuts. There were no permits posted, no signage, just concrete where there shouldn't have been concrete, and water doing its best to adapt. Later that day, a notice appeared on my door. It cited unauthorized alterations affecting community drainage, and informed me that I was responsible for mitigating any conditions that could negatively impact neighboring properties. There was a deadline. There was a fine amount. There was, notably, no mention of the concrete structure upstream. I read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen counter next to my notebook. The contrast between the two felt almost insulting. One documented reality, the other manufactured authority. I didn't respond immediately. I walked back to the creek instead, this time with a camera and a measuring tape. I took photos from multiple angles, noting where the water backed up, where it spilled beyond its usual banks. I recorded timestamps, rainfall totals, flow direction. I didn't dramatize it. I just documented what the land was already trying to say. That evening, I pulled up the county's floodplain maps and overlaid them with current satellite imagery. The concrete sat squarely within a regulated drainage corridor. Not ambiguous, not debatable. It wasn't just a bad idea. It was a violation with consequences that extended far beyond my property line. I sent one email to the HOA, attaching photos and asking a single question: who authorized the construction? The reply came the next morning, brief and defensive. It stated that the HOA had undertaken necessary improvements to prevent erosion and protect downstream homeowners. It suggested that my concerns were exaggerated and reminded me of my responsibility to maintain natural features in a way that did not interfere with community safety. Community safety, apparently, now meant pouring concrete into a creek without consulting anyone who understood water. I replied once more, attaching excerpts from county ordinances regarding drainage modifications and floodplain interference. I asked again for permits. I asked for engineering assessments. I asked for the name of the contractor. The response didn't address any of that. Instead, it warned me against hostile communication and reiterated the fine schedule if I failed to resolve the issue on my property. That was the moment the conversation ended. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. They weren't interested in resolution. They were interested in narrative. And narratives fall apart when evidence enters the room. Over the next week, the creek rose twice more after modest rain. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to change soil composition, enough to kill plants that had never drowned before. I documented everything. I added notes to my binder. I started sleeping lighter, waking at the sound of rain, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. If that water had nowhere to go, it would find somewhere else, and somewhere else might not be forgiving. Neighbors began asking questions, quietly at first. One mentioned standing water near their fence line. Another joked about needing a canoe. I didn't joke back. I told them what I knew, calmly, factually. Some listened, some didn't. The HOA president, I later learned, had already framed the situation as a resistant landowner refusing necessary improvements. It was a neat story. It just didn't match reality. I stopped communicating with the HOA entirely after that. No more emails, no more explanations. Instead, I filed a formal request with the county for a site inspection, citing unpermitted modification of a regulated drainage feature. I attached photos. I attached maps. I attached timelines. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I let the documents speak. The confirmation email came 2 days later. Inspection scheduled. I didn't tell anyone. When the inspector arrived, he walked the creek slowly, the way people do when they already know what they're about to find. He didn't say much. He measured. He took notes. He asked one question. That mattered. Who poured the concrete? I told him the truth. I didn't know, but I knew who hadn't authorized it. He nodded once, like that was enough. That evening, rain came again, heavier this time. I stood on the porch and watched the water rise, press against boundaries it didn't recognize anymore. Somewhere upstream, concrete held fast, indifferent to pressure. I knew then that the HOA had made a mistake that couldn't be smoothed over with meetings or fines. Water doesn't negotiate, and neither does the law when it finally shows up. The inspection didn't end the way the HOA expected it to, though they didn't realize that right away. The county doesn't move quickly, but it moves deliberately, and once it starts, it doesn't reverse itself to spare embarrassment. For a few days after the inspector left, nothing happened. No emails, no notices, no sudden apologies disguised as cooperation, just rain, slow drainage, and the quiet pressure of a problem that hadn't gone away simply because someone stopped talking about it. During that lull, I kept documenting, not obsessively, Not with panic, but with consistency. Morning photos, evening photos, measurements taken from the same fixed points, notes on how long water lingered before retreating. I wasn't trying to build a case anymore. I was maintaining a record, the way you do when you know the situation has shifted from disagreement to consequence. The HOA, meanwhile, tried to regain momentum. A letter arrived by certified mail informing me that the board would be holding an emergency session to address ongoing drainage concerns exacerbated by upstream resistance. My name wasn't used, but the implication was obvious. They invited me to attend, framing it as an opportunity to collaborate. I didn't respond. That seemed to bother them more than any argument could have. Silence, when it's intentional, forces people to confront their own assumptions. Without my participation, their version of events had no friction to push against. It just sat there, fragile. The next communication came from their attorney. It was carefully worded, almost polite, suggesting that all parties shared an interest in preventing environmental damage and that misunderstandings could be resolved through mutual compromise. It proposed a site visit with their contractor present and asked whether I would be willing to allow access. I read it once, then filed it behind the inspection confirmation from the county. I didn't need compromise. I needed compliance, and that wasn't something I could grant them. 3 days later, the county sent its preliminary findings. They were not subtle. The report identified the concrete structure as an unpermitted obstruction within a regulated watercourse. It cited multiple violations: environmental protection codes, floodplain regulations, and improper alteration of natural drainage patterns. It noted increased upstream saturation and potential downstream flood risk. It recommended immediate remediation pending further review. The HOA was ordered to cease any additional work and submit documentation justifying the structure's existence. I printed the report and placed it in the binder without comment. That evening, my phone rang. It was the HOA president. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was clipped, tight around the edges. She said she'd received the county notice and wanted to clarify a few things. She suggested that perhaps the structure had been misunderstood, that its purpose was temporary, that maybe someone had acted without full board approval. She asked me to call her back. I didn't. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a process. And processes don't care who regrets what, only who signed where. The rain came again that night, heavier than before. By morning, parts of the subdivision closest to the creek were dealing with standing water that hadn't been there before. Lawns squelched underfoot, drainage grates gurgled instead of cleared. One driveway near the lowest point had water creeping toward the garage door, shallow but persistent. Photos of it started circulating in the neighborhood group chat. People asked questions. People speculated. Someone mentioned wetlands. Someone else asked whether insurance would cover it. The HOA posted a statement urging calm and assuring residents that the situation was under control. It wasn't. The county. Inspector returned 2 days later, this time with an environmental compliance officer. They didn't just look at the concrete, they traced its impact. They followed the water downstream and upstream, measuring saturation levels, marking affected vegetation. They noted soil displacement patterns that suggested prolonged pooling. One of them asked me when the structure had been built. I told him when I'd first noticed it. He nodded and wrote it down. Another asked whether I'd ever applied for or been granted permission to alter the creek. I told her no, and that I'd never needed to. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than a longer explanation would have. The HOA president arrived halfway through the inspection, visibly flustered, wearing the same practiced confidence she used in meetings. She tried to position herself between the inspectors and the structure, gesturing broadly, talking about erosion control and preventative measures. She referenced residents' concerns. She avoided words like permit. The compliance officer listened. Politely, then asked for documentation. There wasn't any. That's when the tone changed, not dramatically, not with raised voices, but with precision. The conversation stopped being about intent and started being about remediation timelines and penalties. The HOA president's posture shifted. Her gestures became smaller. Her voice softened. By the end of it, the county had issued a formal notice. Of violation, the concrete had to be removed, not eventually, not conditionally, immediately. Failure to comply would trigger escalating fines and potential enforcement actions, including classification of the affected area as protected wetland due to altered hydrology. That last part landed quietly, but heavily. Wetland. Designation doesn't care who caused the problem. It only cares that the conditions now meet the criteria, and once that line is crossed, development doesn't resume. It retreats. The HOA president asked what that meant. The inspector explained it calmly. Restrictions. Long-term monitoring. Federal. Oversight if conditions persisted. Property value implications. The words hung in the air longer than the rain clouds had. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to add. By the end of the week, crews were back at the creek, this time not pouring concrete but jackhammering it out. The work was slow, careful, supervised. Sediment barriers went up. Erosion controls were installed properly. The water began to move again, tentative at first, then more confidently, reclaiming patterns it remembered. But the damage had already been done. The county didn't lift its scrutiny just because the obstruction was gone. The altered flow had saturated surrounding soil long enough to change its classification. Sections of land adjacent to the creek, including parts of the subdivision, were now under review for wetland status. That review didn't stop at the water's edge, and the HOA, for the first time since this began, stopped issuing statements. They didn't need to. Reality was handling it. The review period stretched longer than anyone expected, and that was where the real pressure began to set in. Concrete can be removed in a day. Water, once redirected, takes its time deciding whether it trusts you again. The creek returned to its channel, but the land around it didn't dry the way it used to. Patches of ground stayed dark and soft well after the rain stopped. Vegetation that had never taken hold before began appearing on its own. The kind of growth that doesn't ask permission and doesn't go away just because someone wants it gone. That kind of change gets noticed. County officials weren't the only ones watching now. Word had moved past the neighborhood and into offices that cared less about HOA authority and more about compliance thresholds. Environmental review doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives in follow-up emails, site markers, and quiet requests for access. It arrives in binders that grow thicker without anyone raising their voice. I kept my distance, physically and emotionally. I didn't walk the subdivision. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't join the speculation in the group chats. I focused on my land and on making sure my own records were complete. Every interaction, every notice, every photograph had a place. Not because I was preparing to fight, but because I understood something the HOA still didn't. Once regulators take interest, you don't win by arguing. You win by being accurate. The HOA board, on the other hand, started unraveling in public. An emergency meeting was announced, then postponed. Another was scheduled, then quietly converted to a closed session. Residents began asking questions the EA board couldn't answer cleanly. Would there be fines? Would insurance cover remediation? Why hadn't anyone checked permits before construction began? Who approved the contractor? Those questions didn't come from me. They didn't need to. I heard about them secondhand from neighbors who had once waved casually and now spoke in lowered voices. A few reached out directly, asking what I knew, what I'd filed, what I thought might happen. I answered carefully, never speculating, never editorializing. I told them what was already on record and nothing more. That restraint mattered more than I realized at the time. The county's preliminary findings were followed by a notice from the State Environmental Agency. Not a citation yet, but an inquiry. Requests for documentation, clarification of scope, confirmation of dates. The HOA was now responding to multiple entities, each with its own timeline and authority. That kind of scrutiny doesn't overlap smoothly. It compounds. Meanwhile, the land continued to make its case. What had once been a controlled drainage area was now meeting criteria it hadn't before. Standing water persisted long enough to change soil composition. Native wetland plants appeared, without being planted. Insects followed. Then birds. The inspectors didn't have to imagine impact anymore. They could point to it. One of them said it plainly during a site visit, not to me, but to his colleague. He said the alteration had crossed a threshold, that once the system adjusted, it didn't revert just because someone changed their mind. That sentence stayed with me. The HOA's attorney contacted me again, this time requesting a meeting. The tone was different. No more talk of misunderstanding or collaboration. Just a quiet acknowledgement that things had evolved and that the board wanted to discuss access, boundaries, and future mitigation efforts. He asked whether I'd be open to attending a session with environmental consultants present. I told him I'd consider it. What I didn't say was that I already knew how this part ended, because the issue was no longer whether the HOA had overstepped. That had been settled. The issue now was classification, and classification doesn't negotiate. The official determination arrived in stages, the way bad news often does. First, a provisional designation. Then a request for extended monitoring. Finally, a formal notice identifying sections of the affected area as jurisdictional wetland due to sustained hydrological alteration. That designation didn't just apply to the creek itself. It extended outward, following saturation patterns and vegetation spread. Portions of landscaped common areas fell within it. So did parts of privately owned lots that had been built too close to the low ground. Those homeowners weren't pleased. Restrictions followed quickly. No grading, no fill, no new construction without permits that would likely never be approved. Maintenance activities now required oversight. Anything that disturbed the soil triggered review. Property values don't drop overnight, but confidence does. And once buyers start asking questions sellers can't answer cleanly, the damage is already done. The HOA board issued a statement acknowledging the designation and assuring residents they were working closely with authorities. It didn't mention how the situation had started. It didn't mention concrete. It didn't mention permits. It didn't mention me at all. That omission told me everything. Behind the scenes, resignations began. Quiet ones at first. A board member citing personal reasons, another stepping back due to work commitments. The president held on longer, but her voice carried less weight every time she spoke. You could hear it in the recordings people shared later. Hesitation where there had once been certainty. I was finally invited formally to a meeting. Not an emergency session this time, a scheduled one. Neutral language, environmental consultants present, legal counsel present, agenda attached. I agreed to attend, not because I needed to defend anything, but because this was the moment where everything they'd avoided acknowledging would have to be said out loud, and silence, when it's earned, carries farther than anger ever does. The meeting took place on a weekday morning, the kind chosen deliberately to limit attendance without saying so outright. The HOA clubhouse sat at the edge of the subdivision, all neutral colors and glass meant to project transparency without inviting scrutiny. I arrived early, not because I needed the room, but because I wanted to see who arrived when they thought no one was watching. Environmental consultants came first, rolling cases behind them, already tired in the way people get when they know they're about to explain consequences that could have been avoided. Then the attorney, then 2 board members. I barely recognized, filling seats that had recently belonged to others. The president arrived last, carrying a folder that looked thinner than it should have. No one greeted me with hostility. That alone told me everything had shifted. The meeting opened with procedure, then slid quickly into presentation. Slides appeared, on the screen showing aerial imagery, overlays, hydrology diagrams. The creek before alteration, the creek after. Soil saturation zones expanding outward like something alive. Dates, measurements, photographs taken months apart that told a story. No one could argue with anymore. When they finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not tense, settled. That's when I was asked if I had anything to add. I didn't stand right away. I opened the folder I'd brought with me, thinner than the binders I'd used earlier because at this point I didn't need to overwhelm anyone. I needed to be precise. I began by clarifying one thing. I had never requested enforcement. I had never filed a complaint against the HOA itself. I had only reported an unpermitted obstruction of a natural waterway on my property. Everything that followed had come from that single factual action. Then I placed copies of the original creek survey on the table. Not the modern version, the original. It showed the natural course, the designated drainage function, the buffer, zones that had existed long before the subdivision. I let the consultants compare it to what they'd already documented. They didn't need long. Next came the permits, or rather, the absence of them. No county approval, no state review, no environmental impact assessment, just a contractor invoice and a board vote that had never been authorized to touch moving water in the first place. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I didn't have to. Responsibility doesn't hide well when paperwork is missing. The HOA president tried to speak at one point, attempted to frame the concrete work as minor reinforcement. One of the consultants corrected her gently, explaining that once flow is altered, intent becomes irrelevant. Impact is what matters. That was the moment her certainty finally collapsed. She stopped talking, literally stopped mid-sentence. The kind of pause where you can see someone realizing they no longer control the narrative, no matter how carefully they choose their words. I added one final document to the table, the county notice officially designating the affected area as protected wetland. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, just ink on paper changing the rules permanently. I explained what that designation meant, slowly, because people only hear consequences when they're spaced out. It meant remediation would be limited. It meant future development would be restricted. It meant ongoing monitoring. And it meant liability didn't end with removal of the concrete. It extended to anyone who authorized the alteration. The attorney nodded. He already knew. The consultants packed up shortly after. Their work for the moment was done. What remained was governance, or the lack of it. The meeting ended without a vote. That, too, was telling. Within a week, the HOA president resigned. No announcement, no explanation. Just a line in the next agenda noting a vacancy. 2 more board members followed. Shortly after, the remaining ones moved carefully like people crossing ground they no longer trusted. Remediation began under state oversight. Slow, expensive, incomplete, because wetlands don't revert on command. Once land learns how to hold water, it remembers. The subdivision changed in subtle ways. Lawns near the creek stopped draining properly. Certain areas were reclassified, their use restricted indefinitely. Prospective buyers asked questions realtors struggled to answer without disclosures that killed enthusiasm. The sense of control the HOA once projected faded into something more cautious, more procedural. No one blamed me openly. There was nothing to blame me for. I hadn't flooded anything. I hadn't demanded punishment. I had simply refused to let someone pour concrete where water needed room to move, and the law agreed. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came the way consequences usually do when they're rooted in law instead of emotion, quietly, steadily, and without asking anyone's permission. The remediation work stretched into the next season. Crews came and went under state supervision, moving carefully, documenting everything, leaving more untouched than they repaired because that's how wetlands work once they've been recognized. You don't undo them. You adapt to them. The concrete that had once blocked the creek was removed in stages, hauled away in chunks that looked smaller than the problem they'd created. The water didn't rush back dramatically. It just resumed doing what it had always done, spreading where it needed to, lingering where the land allowed it to linger. The HOA stopped using words like improvement and enhancement. Their emails, when they came at all, shifted into a new dialect: compliance, coordination, consultation. They started asking questions instead of issuing statements. They requested permission instead of assuming it. The clubhouse meetings grew shorter. Attendance dropped. Power, once exposed as conditional, tends to evaporate. Neighbors adjusted in their own ways. Some avoided eye contact for a while, as if proximity to me might reignite something they didn't want to think about. Others did the opposite, stopping by under the pretense of asking about runoff or drainage, conversations that eventually drifted toward apologies without quite saying the word. I didn't push either direction. People come to terms with things on their own timelines. The lots closest to the creek changed hands slowly. Listings lingered longer than before. Descriptions became careful. Phrases like natural buffer and environmentally sensitive area replaced what had once been framed as premium water features. Anyone who looked closely could see the invisible lines now drawn through the neighborhood. Not fences, not walls, just limits that hadn't existed in the HOA's imagination before. At home, the tension drained out of the days the way it had built up, incrementally. My partner stopped asking contingency questions. The binders stayed on the shelf, unopened. Evenings returned to their old rhythm, unremarkable in the best way. The creek sounded the same as it always had, which was the point. Water doesn't care about governance. It cares about gravity, space, and time. No one ever accused me directly of causing the changes. Not in writing, not aloud. There was nothing to accuse me of. The creek hadn't flooded the neighborhood out of spite. It had simply resumed its function after being allowed to breathe again. The designation didn't punish anyone personally. It constrained behavior. That distinction mattered more than people realized. Months later, a new HOA board sent out a letter outlining updated policies regarding environmental compliance and land use boundaries. It referenced lessons learned, the importance of due diligence, the value of respecting pre-existing conditions. My name didn't appear anywhere in it. Neither did the word creek. Accountability often avoids specifics when it's embarrassed by them. Life settled back into something close to what it had been before, with one important difference. The quiet felt earned. I still walked the property in the mornings. I still checked the water after heavy rain. I still split wood before winter because some habits don't need reasons beyond continuity. The land responded the way it always had, steady and predictable, as long as it wasn't interfered with. Looking back, I understand why the HOA thought they could do it. Creeks look small when you don't understand systems. Land looks negotiable when you only see it as a backdrop. Authority feels permanent until it meets a statute that says otherwise. They blocked the water because they thought it was inconvenient. They didn't realize it was essential. And when that misunderstanding finally caught up with them, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter than that. I felt settled. Because the creek was flowing again the way it was meant to. Because the land was doing its job. And because sometimes the most complete kind of justice is simply letting things return to their proper course and staying out of the way while they do.